Welcome to our third and final Holy Week Bible study. We've been working our way through the account of Holy Week that's given to us in Matthew's Gospel. And what we've tried to do is to see what comes out of a grander sweep through the Gospel account than we normally allow ourselves as a church. Well, this final session is actually about a comparatively short passage. We've arrived at chapter 26, and today's discussion is going to be about verses 6 to 13, those verses that describe the anointing of Jesus at Bethany. And we'll see how this passage fits in with Matthew's whole account of Holy Week, the journey from Palm Sunday to the cross and then through to the resurrection. Now, because the anointing of Jesus is also told in all the other Gospels, the other three Gospels, what I've suggested that we do is that we compare the Matthew account with the accounts in Mark, Luke, and John, mainly so that we can disentangle them in our minds and then focus specifically on what the account in Matthew tells us. So I'm hoping that before you've watched this video, you have had a read not only of Matthew 26, 6 to 13, but the other three accounts, that is to say, the one in Mark 14, 3 to 9, Luke 7, verse 36 to the end of that chapter, and John 12, verses 1 to 8. Because the accounts differ. Well, actually, the account in Mark's Gospel is very similar to that in Matthew's Gospel. But when you come to read Luke's Gospel, there are a number of clear differences. So the first one to spot is that in Luke's Gospel, it is the feet of Jesus that are anointed. In Matthew's Gospel, it is his head that is anointed, and the same in Mark. But in Luke, it is the feet that are anointed. Now, when you anoint somebody's feet, culturally, what that signified in the culture of that time was that you were welcoming a guest. That if you were welcoming an honoured guest to a house, you might have a servant bathe the feet of the honoured guest. What anointing somebody's head points to, that is to say, what the account that Matthew gives, is suggestive of what one might do for a king. That is the anointing or the crowning of a king. So there's quite a lot of significance in whether the feet are anointed or the head. And in Matthew's account, it's the head, and in Luke's Gospel, it's the feet. Luke's account happens in a different house. So in Matthew, it's the house of Simon the leper. In Luke's account, we're told that the story happened in the house of a Pharisee. There is a difference as well into what the woman is promised. In Luke's Gospel, it's very clear that the woman who anoints Jesus is promised forgiveness. In Matthew and Mark, the woman is promised fame. And then, looking back at the context in which Luke's account is, we see that the context is very different. Luke's account of the anointing of Jesus is not part of Holy Week at all. It's set in the ministry of Jesus proclaiming forgiveness and inclusion. But in Matthew's Gospel, we see that it's very specifically placed in the run-up to the crucifixion in Holy Week. And then John's account is different again. John gives us a kind of fusion of the two versions. He has the feet being anointed, as does so similar to Luke and not Matthew and Mark, but he places the anointing in the house of Lazarus, so still in Bethany, and he specifically names the woman who anoints Jesus as Mary. So we've got these overlapping stories, and we just need to tease out one or two of those differences to make sure we're not getting confused when we look at Matthew's account. And one of the main areas of confusion that has occurred when we thought about the anointing of Jesus has been to do with the fact that Luke describes the woman as a sinner. She's described as a sinner. Actually, Luke has the Pharisee describe her as the sinner. And for many generations, the church has had a tendency to leap to the assumption that this means that the woman who bathed Jesus' feet was a prostitute. The assumption was made that because she was a woman, that her sin would have some kind of sexual nature. And of course, if you think about it, women are involved in all sorts of sinful behaviour, not just sins of a sexual nature, and they are no more likely to be involved in those sins than men are. So actually, this is a whole red herring, the idea that the woman is a prostitute. It doesn't say that in the gospel account, and we need to just extract it from our assumptions about this story. There's something else, though, in this story, and that is the element of intimacy. It seems to me that the account in Luke's gospel is especially intimate. And actually, Luke specifically refers to the intimacy. I find the account in John's Gospel also very intimate. The account in Matthew and Mark is less so. I think that Matthew and Mark's version of this story is less about the intimacy between the woman and Jesus. So the reason why the story is told differently in different Gospels, it seems to me, is that the story has different functions in different Gospels. When we read Matthew, the account in Matthew, in its context, we have to remind ourselves what happens immediately before the account of the anointing. And we touched on this at the end of the previous Bible study. When Jesus had finished all these sayings, these are the parables that we looked at in the last session, Jesus said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified." So Jesus has just told his disciples that they haven't got long. He is going to be killed. Now, reading Matthew's account in that context, what we see is Jesus being anointed as a king would be anointed. But what Jesus wants you to see is that he is going to die. He says that she has prepared me for my burial. And that becomes especially clear when we remember that this encounter in Bethany comes immediately after those discourses where Jesus has set out to his disciples who he is and what will happen to him. So let's look at this account in Matthew's Gospel in a little bit more detail. Well, first of all, we are back in Bethany. We are back in the place of safety, the place where we can relax away from the battleground that is Jerusalem. We don't know who this woman is. Let's not get it mixed up with John's account. Her identity is not the key part of this story. It's, I think, quite significant that we are even told the name of the man whose house all this happened in, but we're not told her name. We're then told that she came to him, came to Jesus, and she poured out for him. And I think that's worth dwelling on, that she has given of herself for Jesus. And I think part of the context here is that among the final messages that Jesus has for his disciples, admittedly this is stronger in Luke's Gospel and John's Gospel than Matthew's Gospel, but part of the final messages are how we give of ourselves to serve others. And so this woman came to Jesus and she poured out for him. And the disciples' role in all this was to be witnesses. They saw what happened. And Jesus says that what this woman has done will be proclaimed in all the world. Well, who's going to do that proclaiming? That's going to be the disciples, and indeed it was the disciples that went and proclaimed it. But although that was what they were told to do, their actual reaction to what they saw happening was one of anger. Now, why were the disciples so angry? It says the disciples were angry. Why? One wonders why. And part of it must surely be to do with the tensions of the week. As we've seen, from the moment of Jesus' arrival in Jerusalem, this has been a week of conflict and of stress. And then after these days of stress, we have this woman who's now taking center stage, grabbing all the attention. Well, we don't like it when people suddenly grab the attention. We're worried that that kind of approach might work. It might deprive us of the attention that we also crave. I think this happens in churches sometimes. There are people who shout out for attention in church, and actually they need attention. But when they ask for it, they are sometimes, well, people talk against them, and it's seen as a poor thing to do in a church. I think this is a good lesson for the church to see the woman who took center stage with her dramatic action was defended by Jesus, was commended by her. I wonder whether we can be a church where we can allow people to take center stage when they need to. Jesus defends this woman. The animosity of the disciples is actually irrational. And so he asks why. He doesn't believe this concern for the poor that they're suddenly expressing. He wants to direct them to the emotions that they have, the jealousy that they're feeling, which is the source of their anger. And then in his comment on the poor, he redirects them in their thoughts and he directs them to his death that he's just told them about. He's basically saying, look, I've just told you that I'm going to die in 2 days. Why are you not behaving as if your close friend is about to die? Because she is. She is behaving in that way. And then finally he says that what she has done will always be remembered. That when history is written, when the Gospels are written, this act will be recorded and it will be set in its true place in the story because it is part of the story of what's happening. She has accepted that Jesus is king. She has treated him as a king. And by her action, she has pointed the way to his death. So she is helping to tell the story of Jesus walking, accepting obediently his death. So let's just leave aside all those images from the other accounts in the other Gospels because they confuse us and pollute our understanding. We've mentioned them here in this film just to help us to set them to one side. And let's just focus on what the anointing of Bethany means in Matthew's account. The anointing is a sign of the kingship of Jesus Christ. The anointing points the way to his death. And his death will be the victory over all death. It is this victory which heralds the new age, the age we live in now, where Christ is risen and Christ rules as king. And I think that is fundamentally the meaning of the story of the anointing of Jesus. as told in Matthew's Gospel. And that is the final challenge for us for Holy Week before we begin our meditations of the Stations of the Cross. That Jesus has died, he has risen, he is King. Have we fully accepted his kingship in our lives?